If there is anything the Ivy League does not lack, it is controversy.
President Trump is once again escalating his fight with Harvard.
Billionaires who've donated upwards of $500, $600 million to Ivy League schools are now backing out.
The Ivy League is way too expensive. There are potential antitrust violations here that really need to be looked into.
Harvard has been a disaster.
So the whole game has been rigged so rich parents can pass their advantages down to their kids.
Today, I want to understand why the Ivy League has become so politically divisive. And to do that, I would like to welcome on friend of the show, Khyvan Shroff. He's a senior advisor for the Institute of Education, and he holds 4 Ivy League degrees, a bachelor's from Brown University, a MBA from Yale, and a JD and MPP from Harvard. Khyvan, thanks for coming on.
Great to join.
So I want us to start kind of moving back in the timeline, going back to the beginning of when the Ivy League actually started becoming a political issue where both parties began to disagree. Can you explain how that started? How far back do we have to go to find that period of time?
Well, I think that it's central to conversations about American democracy and opportunity as well, which is, I think our parents' generations, and I know I'm a couple years older than you, so maybe somewhere in the middle there, but really were raised on a model that higher education was the key to success in America. And at the top of that stack, you had the Ivy League as sort of that golden, opportunity for especially, I think, a lot of immigrant families, focused on places like Harvard and other, sort of hoity-toity fancy schools. And that was kind of like, I think, piece one of that deliverable kind of breaking down a little bit in recent years as people challenged whether the American dream was a reality that continued to exist in the 2000s. And obviously at the center of that was the idea of college. And, when you zone in, then obviously the media likes to focus on a few schools. And I think people were very competitive, obviously, about going to Ivy League schools. And you saw that culminate in the Varsity Blues scandal, where sort of conspicuous consumption really revealed that even the rich and famous wanted to be able to tick that box like a handbag, get a Harvard degree, get a Yale degree. And I think it really sort of just made the point at a time when returns to education were declining at that level, that we should question the value of these degrees in a changing economic landscape where you have all this digital stuff coming in, you have AI replacing people, and then you had, I think, Donald Trump come in, which he found a very easy target in Harvard at the time that he started to go after them. Obviously, they had a new president, Claudine Gay, who for a lot of reasons was under scrutiny, some fair, some very unfair. And you had these campus protests on the heels of affirmative action being struck down by a conservative Supreme Court and reigniting again a lot of conversations about merit, and not necessarily just with the usual suspects, but sort of throwing this twist in that I think obviously was very intentional and a well-funded right-wing effort to put Asians at the center of this conflict. And so I do think that that was a decades-long effort by the right to do and to fight back against affirmative action. And certainly all those factors happening at the same time have put the Ivy League in the spotlight.
Right. There's of course other controversies like the complaints about free speech on campus, certain ideologies usually on the right being oppressed or marginalized. There's diversity and equity and inclusion, which is kind of included in all this. Critical race theory, which has kind of encompassed the discourse for a few years, ranging from K through 12 to law schools and higher education institutions where those courses are actually present to some extent. I wonder, do you think any of these concerns that people on the right have had with higher education, such as, let's say, admissions policies that are unfair or biased towards certain groups, do you think that any of these concerns are fair and genuine? There's some truth to them, or are they not?
Well, I do think that the number one admissions policy that I think is wrong and unfair is legacy admissions. And I want to get to that in a second. But I also want to make the pitch for affirmative action admissions policies, the way that they were executed at Ivy League schools, which I actually think is incredibly rooted in the realities of merit, which is to say that these schools don't care that much about just getting a perfect score on the SATs. And everyone's known that for decades because that's just one metric. What they want to produce is leaders of the future, people that are going to lead in business and make a boatload of money and donate it to the school. People like Barack Obama, who are going to go be president of the United States, right? That's who they're trying to select. They want change makers, and they want the best. And so it's pretty generic at some point. You could go to any rich community in the country and find enough people to fill a class with perfect SAT scores if they spent years studying for the SAT. So that's not that valuable to those schools. Instead, what they've done is they've said, we are going to compare you within your group of applicants, and we're going to take the best people in each demographic crossover. So if you got, B's at a really tough school on the one hand, and you came from an incredibly poor community, very limited resources. You didn't have that private SAT tutor. You didn't have, access to every AP course on the planet, but you led the student government. You ended up getting a pretty good ACT score or SAT score. And what you've done is you've shown that you have overcome and accomplished this much. And that's not to say that some rich kid at a private school didn't accomplish a huge amount too, but certainly the expectations for that student are higher, and they should be, because the measure of what they accomplished has to start with where did they begin. And so I actually am very for that approach of taking the people that have shown they've accomplished the most, given certain inputs, they've produced certain outputs, and that's differently impressive for differently situated folks. Now, on the issue of legacy admissions, I think it almost does expose that these schools understand they are not delivering on the promise that they set out. Because I think the promise is that if you work really hard and you're successful and you go to one of these schools, you should have a good job, you'll be financially successful, you will, have importance and relevance and cachet in the world. And your children will also then have a better life, right? That's that whole model of the American dream. But I think the reality is, because the economy's changed, because so much has been sort of tossed up in the air, these schools are actually no longer able to guarantee that if you go to Harvard, you're going to get a good job. And I know you're on TikTok, I'm on TikTok. I see so many TikToks, even just this one last month, right, with people graduating without jobs from fancy schools like Cornell, saying they're applying to, dozens of jobs, hundreds of jobs, not getting an answer. And the Ivy League can't really make sure that you get a job. They can't guarantee that. What they can guarantee you as an alumni of their school is that your child is admitted to that school. That's the one factor they actually control. And when we saw that with the Varsity Blues, that itself is of value, that itself is considered a metric of success in this society, that to me exposes sort of an emptiness to the Ivy League model in this moment.
I totally agree with you that legacy admissions are a ghastly practice, a completely elitist, anti-meritocratic practice, and honestly degrades the value of elite institutions, because part of their pitch is that they're selecting for the best of the best. But it turns out that they're selecting for the best of the best, but also some people that actually weren't the best of the best, but they happen to be children of people who were themselves, or perhaps their grandparents were, quite competent individuals. So I think Americans almost uniformly agree that is a practice that needs to end. I do want to speak to a little bit more the complaints that people have regarding admissions. I understand why people are upset about the admissions process, because people have their own personal stories, right? They feel like they did exceptionally well. They were up, above the 99th percentiles or whatever for GPA, for your standardized test scores. They spend a lot of time on their essays, and then they get rejected, and they see other people that really seem much less remarkable by comparison in terms of those traditional metrics, even maybe in terms of the resume they see for those people. And they say, well, there must be some sort of systematic bias here. And I think a lot of that is at least explained by, and of course, there's been studies that have tried to identify bias. I can't speak to those because I'm not an expert on that. But also, there's a lot of subjectivity to the admissions process, right? It's not like there's some sort of robot which looks at people's applications. There's the admissions review committee, or maybe a specific reviewer, and they might just, in their terms of their subjective preferences, really like a person who on paper might not be as qualified as another person. And it makes a lot of sense to me that people would be upset by that. I think that the only way to kind of solve that issue, though, is to have some more form of standardized system, but that it seems difficult to actually do in practice. So I think that that's something that I think a lot of people on the cultural right have been able to speak to very effectively. They can talk to all of these people who feel like they were qualified and were not given this opportunity that deserved it. And they can talk to all the people that know those people, right, who heard those stories. And it's a sentiment that they're able to channel towards this narrative, which is that actually you are right in thinking that the system is unfair. It is unfair. It's been engineered to be this way by people who don't think that you should have as much opportunity as someone else. So I understand why it's been effective politically.
I hear you on that. My only pushback is I have yet to see the incredibly charismatic, dynamic activities, great test scores, perfect grades person that hasn't gotten into one of these schools. It's usually on the circuit, at least on the Fox News circuit and these sort of outlets that tend to push that narrative. It's somebody who got good grades and did incredibly generic things alongside that and might not actually resonate in that interview process, might not actually be the type of student, and of course these schools want this, right? Might not be that type of student that's going to be a student leader, start a new club, go out and engage in the community. That's all part of what these schools want too, and I think that's really fair to want. And I think also when you look to who's actually going to go make it in the real world after college, it's the networkers, it's the leaders. So I'm not saying, I hear you on that, and I think that's fair, and at the end of the day, it just sucks that there aren't enough slots for all the qualified people because so many people are qualified. I would actually switch that and say that's why we should be less obsessed with the Ivy League, because there's so many great schools in the country that can provide you a high-quality education with lots of resources and opportunity, and I think the way that we've bucketed 8 schools to be, the make or break is really problematic, but I do think people need to sort of be a little bit objective in their assessments when they feel that their kid had their spot stolen. Because if you compare to some of the people that go to these schools, they don't measure up. That is a fact.
Well, so usually they don't compare themselves to the very best people that got
right,
in.
right.
The average
they find
student,
the worst. But also, they don't have a lot of similarities with that.
They compare themselves to that one student who got in with like a score that's like, 70th percentile or something like that. That's the person they compare to. And yeah, I think those off chances, it is hard to make those sort of comparisons. People are always biased towards themselves. And I think it'd be good if people had some more humility in that respect. Of course, I really cannot deny with some of the stuff I've read that some people have really just gotten tough luck, where they haven't gotten the kind of admissions offers that like any objective person would say that they deserve. And I think that there could be things that we could do to make the education process more objective. Of course, that's a topic for another day. Another question I have for you, because I think that this is a big concern amongst many of the people that have become increasingly critical of Ivy League institutions, is that they're actually not impartial. They're very politically biased and skewed in one direction over the other. It's like a liberal, cabal of people that only promote themselves. And if you're a conservative, you can't get a position at an academic institution. They might even deny your application if they see that you're conservative. Is there any evidence that supports that? Do you think there's any merit to that belief?
I certainly don't think that in terms of admissions that there's any evidence of that. What I do think I've seen actually just anecdotally, so not, I can't speak beyond that, is somewhat the opposite, where these schools really turn over every rock in the country to find, Trump supporters, conservatives from different regions and areas that could do the work at the schools. And I'll give you an example. A school like Harvard Law School, I think the year below me, had every single state represented except for Montana. They couldn't find somebody from the state of Montana to go to Harvard Law School. And I guarantee you, as an admissions officer or a dean at Harvard Law School, of course you want to be able to go on those fundraising tours and you want to be able to speak about your class and say, I have all 50 states and XYZ countries represented in my class. So absolutely, they have every incentive to do that. And they do that, by the way. They invest and bend over backwards, I would say, for the conservative students. If you are a Fed soccer, you have a leg up at Harvard, and you have a leg up, by the way, after Harvard, because it's a smaller group competing for clerkships and all those things. So I would say the opposite. I do think fundamentally, I went to the Kennedy School. It's a school of government. If you hate government, you probably don't want to go to the Kennedy School of Government. It's just sort of not something that's going to sync with your values. Now, of course, the ones that do go, they don't really care about what they're going to learn at the Kennedy School of Government, and we could talk about that separately, but right, they want to go for their career. They want to be Dan Crenshaw, who went to the Kennedy School of Government. They want to be Pete Hegseth, who went to the Kennedy School of Government. So the idea that, they're biased against these folks, I think, is somewhat of a marketing by these conservative voices who want to exploit, all the gains of the Ivy League and cachet, and then go kind of pretend that they're not part of that. But the reality is they're just as obsessed as the liberal side.
Right. No, there's plenty of conservative students at Ivy League institutions, and there's also conservative faculty members. Now, it's less likely that a faculty member will be conservative because, well, who are the kind of people who really like academia? Well, it's overwhelmingly disproportionately people on the left, and we see huge amounts of education polarization these days, where people on the left are dramatically more likely to have a college education. And so it's just like, you're having selection in two ways. First, the pool of people that could become professors, or the pool of people with PhDs, and they're overwhelmingly more liberal. And the pool of people with PhDs who want to be academics is even more liberal, right? So I think you do see very high profile, very right-wing faculty members at plenty of universities, such as at a Harvard Law School, where there's a very high profile right-wing law professor, which I think has been an ideological inspiration for J.D. Vance to a certain extent. You could speak more to that than I can, but you mentioned earlier, go ahead.
No, but just to, it's kind of funny because we're talking liberal and conservative. Go to Brown and ask the average student, do you think the faculty here is liberal? They're going to tell you they think the faculty is conservative. Go to Harvard Law School, ask the same question. They'll say the same thing. And yes, absolutely, to your point, those professors that are the ideological leaders of the conservative movement are absolutely, at the Yales and Harvards. And by the way, Yale and Harvard define themselves on that. They want that. They want the best of both. FedSoc was, actually the guy that taught me con law at Brown in undergrad was one of the founders of FedSoc, Stephen Calabrese. So, I think people are always surprised by that, but the reality is these schools would not succeed to the extent they have if they were that partisan. And by the way, just look at the Trump administration. When I was at Harvard, I think, I wrote a piece for the Crimson listing out in his first administration the 40 plus Harvard alum that were powering the Trump administration. So again, I think it's much more about culture and class divides than necessarily about right versus left.
Right. I think that's absolutely the case. And to say a little bit more about the Federalist Society, which you referenced multiple times, for those of you who do not know, you're maybe not really super involved in the law world, the Federalist Society is a right-wing legal organization which helps recruit future right-wing judges, helps Republicans choose who they're going to nominate. It helps get clerks for those judges. It's an entire ecosystem on its own. And it's hugely supportive. So it's actually easier if you're a right-winger to get a clerkship, to be able to go work for a judge than it is for somebody on the left. And that, it's in part because there's less conservative law students. And so like if you go to a campus, like I'm a incoming law student at UVA, we have a very big, well-funded Federalist Society club, and pretty much all top law schools have that similar situation. Actually, it's the organizations on the left which are weaker and smaller by comparison. I think a lot of people would be surprised by that. Now, let's visit the last thing that I think that is a common issue cited with Ivy League institutions. It's this notion that they're actually not intellectually rigorous. When people go to Ivy League institutions, they basically are all going to pass. It's a way that the elites, rub elbows with each other. They're not academically rigorous at all. Is there truth to that? Does it depend on the institution, or is that just completely made up by people who are coping with the fact they didn't get in?
I do think there's some truth to it depending on the institution, because these schools have tried to adapt, and I think in the most positive light, they've tried to increase access to education. In the more cynical light, they are a business and they know that their brand is of value and they want to get as many people engaged as possible and charge them for that and rubber stamp a degree. And I think, where I've seen that, in my experience at least, I do think, business school, certainly, I'm sure a lot of people can share their experience in business school. Business school is really more of a networking opportunity. It's not that rigorous. And I certainly had people that, probably would have failed a class in a different type of institution, but they kind of give you a pass or they give you a low pass. At Harvard Law School, our grades were, you could get a distinction, the top percent, and then, some people get like an honors, most people get a pass, and even if you kind of fail, they'll give you what's called an LP, a low pass. So I absolutely think there's some credibility to that. Places like the Kennedy School, I would say 100%. The Kennedy School is a place where I was shocked by my experience there, and luckily I had other opportunities at the law school and doing my MBA beforehand that I felt were more valuable. But Kennedy School is accepting people with, pretty average grades, not great grades, from colleges, and then they actually don't release their test scores. At least when I was going there, they don't release the test scores because they don't want to be compared to business schools and law schools. And then, the curriculum is really an intro to everything, intro to stats, intro to US government, intro to economics, all of those things. And it really is an AP level curriculum. And then you're giving people a Harvard graduate degree and, acting like they should go run the world. And I do think there's something wrong about that. And I think there's a lot of resentment when things like that happen, because there is so much clout and so much stress, I think, growing up and at high school put behind, you need to go to these schools to be successful. And there's that's premised on this idea that the people that go there and graduate from there should have something of value and should be better to some extent than some other comparable, person and graduate. And I think that's not really that true. Now, should we think that way in the first place? I think, we could talk about that, and we talked about it a little bit. There's so many good schools to go to make a difference. But I do think there's a little bit of gaming happening there, and that if people really looked at the curriculum, I had one assignment at the Kennedy School, I kid you not, that I sent it to a dean because I was like, this is an assignment. Oh, because honestly, I was pissy that they wouldn't let me place out of the class, even though I'd already taken a very similar class. And I was like, you literally have me sitting in this class. The assignment was 20 minutes of class, one paragraph, edit out the redundant words to make it tighter. And I kid you not, this is like a third grade English assignment that they have these 30-year-old adults doing at Harvard in a graduate program. And this is what they're having people spend their time doing. It was stunning. So I think there's a lot of examples like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's absurd. And there certainly are certain programs at Ivy League institutions which seem clearly to me, at least, to be credential mills. Harvard, of course, has this online program. I've seen a lot of people that get a certificate from Harvard, which I look at them and I'm like, there's just simply no way you would actually qualify to get into an actually rigorous program there. So yeah, I find that interesting. There's other institutions which have grade deflation, like the University of Chicago. I think there's some sort of happy medium where people are not depressed and suicidal and have no work-life balance, but it's also very, very rigorous. I think you also see kind of credential inflation across the spectrum, grade inflation. It's getting easier and easier to make high GPAs. I deny that fact because I made a high GPA, so I like to say that I'm very special. It was very challenging, actually, parents. But I think we addressed a lot of the big areas of complaints against the Ivy League institutions. I want to transition on to what the Trump administration is currently doing to target Ivy League schools. That he's targeted a variety of them. Many people in the audience know that he started with Columbia University. Could you walk us through the timeline of the institutions that he's gone after, why he's gone after them, and what the response then has been?
Sure. So I think the minute this all sort of exploded was they had that congressional hearing with the presidents of Penn and Columbia and Harvard. Admittedly, they were not that well prepared to answer those questions. At least they were not prepared to answer it, understanding what was really going on, which was that it was the Republicans putting on a show for the media and voters, and really all around this issue of campus protests and anti-Semitism, and a real feeling among a lot of people on both sides of the political, aisle that these schools had not handled those protests well in terms of protecting Jewish students. And they kind of blew that up to say, all right, well, we're going to throw the weight of the federal government at you because of this issue. But I think at the same time, it was so clear that so many other cultural dynamics, like the discussion about DEI, were also on the table for Republicans, that they ended up obviously pushing for Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, to resign over somewhat disputed plagiarism allegations. And all of this kind of led to additional fallout. You had Columbia ultimately, when Trump came back and sort of really put pressure on them, trying to take a deal that didn't seem to work out for them because they still don't have their funding and they caved to Trump, which makes, sort of nobody happy with Columbia. And then Harvard was in the position of going second, which is always better, and sort of saw, I think, what happened to Columbia and said, all right, well, we're going to sue and we're going to stand up to the Trump administration. But I think people need to understand, because it's a very fair question to ask, why does a $40 billion endowed institution like Harvard need federal government money? This is money not to pay for food at the cafeteria, not to pay for salaries of the run-of-the-mill faculty or housing or any of those things, or the gym. This is grant money awarded by the federal government so that we can continue to be leaders in STEM. That's why everyone from around the world comes to our universities. It's a huge advantage. And what these are is the innovations you've seen in COVID vaccines, in all sorts of things, Human Genome Project. These are things done where the federal government finds it efficient, and also some local governments find it efficient to partner with these major, well-resourced research institutions on projects that the government thinks would serve the public good. And the idea is that it's much more efficient than the government recreating what Harvard, as the leading research institution in the country, can do on these projects. So they're winning grants that they're applying for. This is not money that is going to anything else. So that's important to clarify. And I think what you saw is Harvard stood up for it because Columbia didn't get the money after caving. So, as excited as I think a lot of people are, and by the way, as I think, this was a lifeline for Harvard in a lot of senses, because I've talked a lot about, I think the Ivy League is declining in relevance, and certainly was in recent years, not just because they're at the center of the culture wars, but there's so many economic changes happening where the returns to college are not necessarily at the level that they used to be, where, you do have these people that were able to see during the COVID pandemic that education can be delivered virtually, and maybe we don't need such big costs to all these programs. And maybe at the end of the day, AI is really going to do a lot of the things that you go to these schools to do. So, good example, you graduate from Harvard Law School. A lot of my classmates have a starting offer of $215,000 as a first-year associate at a big law firm, and that's a lot of money. And law school is a lot of money, so you do a calculus and maybe that works out and it's a worthwhile investment. But what happens when AI can do the work of a, first year, second year, third year associate, which I think will happen quite soon. It's not
the lawyers lobby to ban it.
Yeah, there you go. Certainly you, as an incoming law student, I feel you, man. but I think then you're not going to get that salary right out of law school, and of course the value of law school is going to go down. But I think second, you got to realize Harvard is a business. And so Harvard suing Trump is not necessarily, it's actually just 100% not, I guarantee you, about these higher values and principles. It's about they want their money, and they're going to take the action that makes sense for the business of Harvard. It didn't make sense for Harvard to cave. By the way, does it now make sense? Because I know Trump came out and announced they have a deal and nobody knows what the details are and who knows if it's true. But sure, could I see them renaming the Center for DEI or whatever? And that's, of course, not what it's called. But, and making those sort of superficial changes to give Trump his headline win that so many people have made that concession. And we've seen that over and over again when it's sort of not really a win, but it's a little PR win for Trump. I can see them doing that because that's probably the smartest, most, institutionalist, practical thing they could do to protect themselves.
That seems plausible to me. It seems to me that the Republican Party is aware that there's a huge amount of grievances that people have against Ivy League institutions. and they're looking to signal that they're doing political action to punish these people for all the bad things they've done. And of course, it's different bad things. There's a huge wide variety of bad things, and I think within each person that's mad at Ivy League institutions' minds, there might be a different bad thing which sticks out the most. But he's trying to say, okay, well, I'm showing these guys who's boss, right? Just like whenever he attacks members of the media for being dishonest, right? There's another grievance that he's kind of signaling to there. And of course, Ivy League institutions, as you mentioned, are run by people who are looking out for the interest of the institution, right? The big donors that have spent so much money on trying to invest in new buildings, support certain programs, they're not eager to throw all of that away to see like financial devastation happen to this organization to send a political message. Of course, though, I don't doubt that there's probably some people on the board of Harvard or whatever institution we're referencing who probably do have some ideological stances. Now, I think this is an interesting opportunity for us to talk about the real paradoxes within the conservative movement. People like Josh Hawley, J.D. Vance, Ted Cruz. These are folks that are Ivy League educated. Josh Hawley, J.D. Vance went to Yale Law School. Ted Cruz, Harvard Law School. There's many more that belong to those institutions and other prestigious institutions. Donald Trump went to Wharton, which he was very proud of in 2016. He doesn't mention it so much nowadays. He doesn't mention that whenever he went, the acceptance rate for transfers was like 45% or 50%.
And he went to the undergrad. I mean, he didn't go to business school there.
He transferred to the undergrad. Listen, this isn't to just attack Trump as cheap political points, but genuinely it wasn't nearly as impressive as it is today. That's just the facts of that matter. But all that to say, there's a lot of conservative politicians whose entire identity is consumed with hating on the same institutions where they've attended. We'll play some of those clips now.
A number of universities, including some very prominent ones that love to call themselves elite, have said they're not going to follow that executive order. They're going to keep having men in women's locker rooms. They're going to try to get men in women's sports.
What I really don't need to happen is I can't let Harvard have such an explicitly racist and in violation of the Civil Rights Act approach to how it funds and trains scientists.
I don't know how I would have survived as a student at Princeton today because the attitude of the left of punishing and silencing speech, I think is really dangerous.
Okay, so now that you've seen those clips, what do you think about these politicians and kind of this awkward space they occupy in the conservative movement?
Well, I think I don't think it's an awkward space. I think, Republicans, a lot of those people are deeply hypocritical in not only, where they went to school, but the values they talk about and how they treat, their families, all sorts of things like that, right? That's a tale as old as time. But I think what's more is that the left, and I just mean, liberals in general, and the media have totally accepted that narrative. And they do that a lot. But I think in this case, right, with Obama and Hillary and all those people, they kind of just were like, oh, yeah, this criticism's so fair, we should be less elitist, without saying, oh, well, which Republican presidents didn't go to an Ivy League school? I think there's a great irony, actually, in that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were the first ticket in the White House to not have an Ivy League degree between the two of them. And you had Ron DeSantis, you had Vivek Ramaswamy, you had Trump, you had all those folks on that Republican debate stage who all of them went to Ivy League schools, right? Most of them went to two. And yet somehow Democrats still accept that label. So I think that's honestly more of just losing the narrative and sort of marketing war there. But I think there's sort of this idea of elitism that, yes, those institutions are part of. I really also think fundamentally, the first question you asked me is how did these schools get tossed into the culture war? I think, one word answer would be Obama, because I think that there's just an obsession that you see with Donald Trump, but you see with a lot of Republicans about Obama. They hated that he was young. They hated that he went to Harvard. They hated that he sounded super smart and was also super fun and relatable, and they'll never, ever get over that. And they really think of him as like the example of that like elitist liberal that they hate, and they really associate with him with Harvard, I think, a lot. I do think that is one of the main drivers of a lot of that conversation.
Well, and I think if Pete Buttigieg ends up becoming the Democratic nominee, now he's somebody who's currently, I think, #1 in the polls. Of course, it changes all the time in terms of the 2028 Democratic primary. God willing, it actually ends up happening and there's an election. I think that they're going to be using the fact that he went to Harvard as his undergraduate institution against him. I think they've already seemed to be successful, right, in landing these sort of attacks on other Democrats because, I mean, that is the cultural touchstone that I think binds the MAGA coalition together. It's the idea that our country's been run by this set of elites, liberal elites,
Right.
who are different from you in every single way. They went to schools that you could never imagine going to. They read this, they live in these places that are really different and often very scary and very terrible. They have very different values. They like all these weird things, right? Not to minimize these people's perspective, but this is the kind of pitch. And I think the Ivy League has become part of their otherization mechanism and their ability to present the other side as very elite.
And you make a really great point because, right, it's bigger than just education. It is about culture because you have somebody like J.D. Vance, who we know went to Yale, and he's pretending, in a tweet a couple days ago, I'm sure you saw, that he doesn't know what Les Mis is. There is zero chance on this earth that J.D. Vance does not know what Les Mis is when he's at the Kennedy Center and he's never heard of that. Not possible, but it's sort of this theater of I'm super relatable, and of course I'm not an out-of-touch elite. By the way, they made a movie of Les Mis, so I'm pretty sure a lot of people who didn't go to Harvard or Yale know what Les Mis is. It's ridiculous. Or you see him, dressing in drag in those photos of him at Yale in drag. It's all, he totally understands all of that. He totally knows it's not, the existential threat that he will frame it as. And people just eat it up. But I think we have to just be clearer about calling out those examples.
Yeah. And for all the ones that went to Ivy League institutions themselves, the narrative is consistent. I went there and I saw how terrible it was. They were terrible to me. Everything was so bad. The conservatives were totally oppressed. I went into the belly of the beast and I survived it. I survived going to.
Oh my God! Wait, I will send you this after if you want to cut it in. But either way, Scott Jennings is a great example of this. So Scott Jennings was on CNN giving an interview about how Harvard only produces professors versed in destroying Western civilization. And I made a TikTok, cut to, literally Scott Jennings was my professor at Harvard.
There are other reasons to pick on Harvard. Some are political, and the Ivy League in general, and some
all are political.
And some have to do with this. I think the average American probably looks at this and says they're sitting on a $53 billion endowment. Right. They want another $2 to $9 billion, and at the same time, they keep turning out a bunch of professors and students who appear to be schooled in one thing only: the downfall of Western civilization. Why are we financing this?
It's so interesting to hear Scott say that, because who was my professor at Harvard? Scott Jennings. I even went to his office hours. And I think what's interesting is I remember distinctly at the time he would tell that story that a lot of conservatives at Harvard tell, the American dream. How did someone like him, such humble background, end up at a place like Harvard? It's like everyone there thinks they're Goodwill Hunting that has that background. It's a little interesting to me. And I love this, that I even emailed myself at the time in the class, because obviously I was on Twitter, but Scott was tweeting as the professor during the class. So talk about quality of professorship. I guess he wouldn't know.
Kid you not. So the level of lying and delusion is beyond, and of course, again, consistent beyond Harvard. Scott Jennings is a mouthpiece on CNN, another thing that all these Republicans claim to hate, and yet they chase these sort of liberal institutions also. They really want that validation as well. It's interesting to see.
Right. That's super interesting. I want us to move to one final question that we can end this conversation on. This is something that I've observed. I like to stalk the LinkedIns of different high-profile people in politics, so I could kind of understand their history. Certainly, no negative intentions there, but I like to understand, like, where are these people coming from? You know, like how did people get to these positions? It's part of career planning. Now, I'm not planning on being a senior staffer in the Trump administration or working at the Heritage Foundation.
Well, you're the right age, right?
I am the right age, and I look the right way. Sometimes people assume I'm conservative. I don't know why, but after looking at all these high-profile people in the conservative movement, I've actually noticed a shocking number, especially of the young ones, have come from completely conservative institutions that were founded to be genuinely biased towards conservatism and to spread conservative ideology. I'm thinking about Hillsdale College. I think Mercatus to a lesser extent. Now we're seeing the rise of another university. I think it's University of Austin, which is another one of these like conservative.
Barry Weiss gem.
Right. Like there's a lot of these, Liberty University is another great example. It seems that the conservative movement is largely substituting out maybe like traditionally prestigious institutions for some institutions that are kind of like they're incubators for the next generation of conservative leaders. Do you notice that to any sort of to any extent? And do you think that there is? Do you have any commentary on the rise of alternative conservative institutions?
Well, I think of it two ways. I hear your point that these are certainly a growing type of school that we're seeing. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, I watched recently that Tucker Carlson interview. I watched clips of it with Ted Cruz. And Tucker Carlson keeps reading those ads for Hillsdale and all those types of schools and says, this is much better. You'll get a Christian education. But I think it also touches on a point, right, that Charlie Kirk said recently that women should go to college for their MRS degree. It's not about arguing that like these schools are giving your kids a great education. Like I don't think they even start from that premise, and I don't think they're saying they're going to graduate smarter than kids that go to Harvard. And like go get better jobs and be more successful. That's not even what they're arguing. They're saying just like, you know, come here to partner up. That's a big selling point of these schools. They are very focused on finding, you know, partnership, and a lot of the women. There's a whole TikTok trend around those schools where they ask them like, would you rather graduate or get engaged during your time here? Like if you had to choose, and the students choosing whether they'd rather their degree or an engagement ring. And so I think that's much more the premise. And of course you overlap that with the sort of Christian fundamentalism that underscores all those places. And I don't know that it's about crafting the next generation of leaders as opposed to just creating, you know, churning out sheep, I would say, you know, at scale, the same way that they feel that liberals use, you know, more traditional higher education to do. And obviously there's a lot wrong with that logic, but I don't know that they're like crafting the next big leaders. But what I can say is I think that what you're identifying is a lot of overlap between the funders, the super rich people behind a lot of those schools, and the powerful Republicans behind those schools, and the same folks behind Heritage and those big Republican organizations that do sort of push out the next generation of thought leadership and ideas for those people. I think there's just so much overlap in the funding and people in those spaces that maybe that's fair to say, but I don't know that it's more of a pipeline that is actually pushing out, you know, the next generation of conservative leaders. Because to your point in our last, you know, sort of chat topic, a lot of those people are still going to the Harvards and the Yales and all those places. So, you know, it's kind of an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I do find it really fascinating and ironic how they've created a alternative set of institutions which does exactly the thing that they've accused liberal institutions of doing. They say liberal institutions are propaganda centers. They're only pushing one form of ideology on you, right? They don't care about balance or the truth. They don't care about they silence the other side. And then they've created these institutions which are like almost like pretty explicit in doing that for conservatism. Like, wait, I thought that was bad. Like, I thought we wanted free speech, right? The University of Austin caught some flack for this because at least they've branded themselves as being a place for ideas and a place for balance and nuance. But I think they got rid of one of their professors for having a perspective that was pro DEI or affirmative action or something like that. They just axed them like that for having an opinion which broke with their like central orthodoxy. So I think there's a tremendous irony there. But you're right. There still is plenty of people within the conservative movement which come from those very same Ivy League institutions that they've come to attack so much. Thank you for shedding light on what it's like to go to Ivy League school, why they've become a cultural touch point, and they've been increasingly under fire. It's been a fantastic time talking to you about this, and I hope you come back on the show some other time.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Oh, do you have a channel you would like to plug?
Yes, I do. You can follow me on YouTube at Kaivon Comments. And I will drop a comment below this video too so people can find it.
He will drop a comment. I'll like it, so it'll be at the top of the feed. I'll also put his @ in the bio so you can click it, go to his channel. Make sure to support him. He's a brilliant person. You already know that by now. It's good to support small YouTubers. People supported me as I've been growing. It's been a huge help for me. So make sure you do it for him. Thanks so much, guys.